Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Kevin Zwicker from Fast Count, and this is your August 18th Monday Night Raw post show here, provided to you by the Fast Count. And this was a pretty big couple of days for the WWE. We're coming off of Triple Mania, which was a big success in Mexico. I mean, it feels as if everybody was watching it for the most part. It blew up the timeline a lot. They had almost 20,000 people in attendance. We all had the viral moments, involving, Mr. Iguana and Yennefer and Di Memento, and that moment that everybody is talking about with Almost and Microman. But this episode of Monday Night Raw took place in Philadelphia. And going into that, knowing the fact that you have Paul Heyman, being the mouthpiece for this new group, The Vision, then being in the hometown of ECW, you knew that there was going to be some type of references or some type of tribute to that fact, and we got that. But guys, I'm just going to be straight up and shoot from the hip with you guys here. And there were some things that went down on this show that was interesting, and I'm going to get to it. The Naomi announcement. I like the vignette that we get with Bayley. That video package was pretty interesting. And I like what they're doing with Becky Lynch. But what I'm not feeling at all is this bloodlineification of this group, The Vision. And when I say bloodlineification, if you guys paid attention to the bloodline and all the different iterations that we've gone through with that group, whether it's the OG version with Roman Reigns leaning, or the version that we have currently on SmackDown with Solo Sikoa and the MFTs, we all know the way that these shows start and end. It starts with this talking segment with the group starting off the show, and then it ends with them main eventing the show somehow or not. And we get this brawl with multiple different people interfering, and we either get a DQ or getting all of these different things that we're seeing, all these different multi-man crashings or involved with these men. ECW is so underrated. Is it underrated at this point where it's like, we've had so many different tributes over the past 20 plus years and multiple different, pay-per-views, the one night stands, in TNA, they had their version of Hardcore Justice. I mean, I feel like they squeezed as much juice out of those three letters as they possibly can over the past 2+ decades. I've always, one thing they kind of have over WCW in a way is, nobody ever has asked for a WCW one night stand pay-per-view, right? Nobody has ever, outside of little one-offs, with NXT, have they used, pay-per-view names, They've never had WCW tribute shows. So, but this Vision group, like I said, they have just kind of sucked the enthusiasm out of me when it comes to it, because they've just been so formulaic in that instance. And I personally enjoy it when we have these different groups, over the years, but I like it to where they're presented differently and distinctly. And it just feels as if you're trading out different pieces and different names, and we're just getting the same thing presented with all these different groups. The bloodlineification of these factions. Guys, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't. But we start off the show, like I said, with the Vision, and obviously with Paul Heyman, ECW, Philadelphia, the connections all make it there. And he says, in this city, I'm not in God mode. I am a god. He says, I would have a statue out here, but I am too humble for that. It says, and he goes on, he starts doing his introductions of the members of the Vision. Braun Breaker, the big dog, this is his yard now. Bronson Reed, the tribal thief, with all these different pairs of Roman Reigns' J's around his neck. He goes on, the Visionary, the Revolutionary, the undisputed World Heavyweight Champion in the WWE, Seth Rollins. And I always kind of giggle when they say that, the undisputed champion, because it is very much disputed. If you have two shows with two different heavyweight titles, that is the definition of disputed. If you have, but that's just me being, Captain Literal Man, right? And before Seth Rollins even gets to talking, he gets interrupted by Jey Uso. Jey Uso, he is in the crowd. He has multiple kids around him. and they're all saying, he's passing the mic around, and they're all saying, yeet. This is, Seth Rollins, tired of hearing you talking, tired of hearing you disrespect my family. He's like, all these different things. He brings up the fact that he tapped out Gunther at WrestleMania. And then you see Seth Rollins kind of being like an instigator in Braun Breaker's ear. Because they have a match set up in the main event of the show. Says he thinks he's better than you. He thinks he bench presses more than you. He thinks his family's more important than you. He thinks his family is greater than you. Your uncle's a moron. He thinks your family's just a bunch of fat asses. As we all know, his Uncle Scott is not a fan of, the more overweight individuals on this planet. And Braun Breaker's getting all worked up and all of that. He says, since we're in ECW, you know what this basically means. And we set up a hardcore Extreme Rules match for the main event. Maybe it's just the desensitization of violence when it comes to my viewing of these different stipulations. With all these different, companies like CCW and GCW and AEW, where you see guys, just bleeding buckets all over the places and using, fluorescent lights and seeing syringes being placed in guys' mouths, knowing the way that WWE's product is, you know that this is going to be the most sanitized version possible of that stipulation. So it kind of hampers my excitement for it. But hey, it's something different, and it makes it so we're guaranteed that this match isn't going to end with a DQ, which I think that's a good thing for everybody around, right? We get a recap of last week. Io Sky, her and the Kabuki Warriors, especially Asuka mainly, they got into a little kerfuffle. And you saw Asuka push Io Sky last week. And then we see Io Sky getting ready for her match backstage. You see her being approached by the Kabuki Warriors. Asuka apologizes for what went down. And she says, let us know if you need something. We have your back. And Io says, I do know that you guys have my back, and I appreciate it, but I got to do this alone. And we are set up with a match between Io Sky and Raquel Rodriguez. Raquel Rodriguez, ever since Kevin Nash said that she needs to work bigger, you can see a big-time difference in her in-ring work. I brought that up every single time that I've seen her match because I feel like it's something that needs to continue to be highlighted because prior to that statement by Nash and that advice that those gems that he was giving her, Raquel really wasn't that special in the ring. I just looked at her as another, larger woman, but didn't really enjoy her matches that much. But ever since Nash made that statement on his podcast, you can really tell that she's absorbed that information, and it's been a big benefit. I remember years ago when Hangman Adam Page, was on one of those panels at GalaxyCon, and he spoke about how, he doesn't take advice from the vets. He's kind of one of those guys that kind of wants to do things and learn it on his own. Obviously that pissed off CM Punk immensely, but in this case, Raquel took advice from the vet. Hangman is doing well for himself as well in AEW. So, there's two different ways that, you can skin a cat. But I enjoyed this match a lot because, like I said, Raquel, she's worked a lot bigger. She's become this, force. And I've said it on multiple different occasions as well that I consider Io Sky to be the best in-ring wrestler in WWE at the current moment. I feel like it is not even close. I feel like the women's division has been smoking the guys ever since WrestleMania. Just think about all the storylines, the high-profile storylines involving the men right now. I think that outside of this farewell tour with John Cena, I really don't think that there's a lot of juice in any of those storylines. And even then, I think that they have pretty much botched that from the very start, especially with the heel turn. So I think that the women have really been the individuals holding down the product so far this year, right? But you see multiple different occasions where Raquel is just bullying Io throughout this match. Io, she attempts to make a comeback, but it's very much short-lived. There was different spots where Io tried to hit her signature moonsault, but Raquel was able to pick up her knees and block it. You see Roxanne Perez on the outside, lurking around like a piranha throughout this whole match. And we get to a point where, Roxanne gets taken out by Io to just make it a one-on-one match, just where everything is even Steven. And then we get to the moment where she hits her moonsault to pick up the win. 1, 2, 3. Io continues the momentum that she has been carrying on for a while. But you knew that with Roxanne Perez on the outside, it wasn't going to be that way for long. So Roxanne Perez and Raquel, they give Io a case of the beats. But then we get a save from Rhea Ripley and not the Kabuki Warriors. And Rhea Ripley and Io Sky are able to clean house and stand tall. You see later on in the night where Io is backstage and you see Rhea try to comfort her. And then you see the Kabuki Warriors approach them and say, so Rhea can help you, but we can't. And then you see Rhea say, I was just there to help Io because you guys weren't around. We see them go back and forth, and then we see Io screaming, over both of them and walking away in frustration. A lot of drama surrounding Io Sky and the Kabuki Warriors, which signals in my mind that we are, sooner rather than later going to be seeing a Io versus Asuka match, which I'm sure all of you guys, and me included, are excited to see. What do you guys think? I did a video about this, I think, last night. This is a little bit off topic. But what do you guys think about WWE bringing back WrestlePalooza for that to go for that to go head-to-head with AEW All Out on All Out weekend? I think that's pretty nuts, right? That's pretty nuts because I'm pretty sure that show is going to be headlined with John Cena versus Brock Lesnar. And if you had to put a gun to my head, show-wise, I'm going to assume that AEW is going to have the better show, right? I think it's pretty fair to say that when it comes to pay-per-views, AEW more times than not is able to produce a very well, put together show, pay-per-view wise. But out of those two shows, I'm going to be pretty sure that WWE, if we're getting Cena versus Lesnar on that card, I'm pretty sure that that's going to be the show that people are going to be coming away talking about more because it's just such a high-profile match, involving Cena and Brock Lesnar, a match that we haven't seen in 10 years. Whether, you're pro-Brock or anti-Brock, he's somebody that gets people talking. And with this being a match that many people didn't, put on their bingo cards as to what we were going to get during this retirement tour, I think that that's going to be the match that's going to steal the highlight, steal the headlines coming out of that weekend. And I think that that's what the point WWE is trying to do. I think that, we throw the word competition around, kind of loosely, and everybody kind of has their different definitions of what they view as competition. I've said it from pretty much the get-go. I do believe that WWE and AEW are in competition, not the same type of competition that WWE and WCW were in, where there was a possibility that WCW was going to be able to put WWE out of business. But they do compete for the same free agents. They do compete for the same market space. They do compete for headlines. And I think that the only reason for WWE to put a show, especially a main roster show now, this is different from when they were doing with the NXT shows. I think the only thing that they're doing that for is to steal headlines and try to stifle AEW's momentum any chance that they possibly can, because I honestly think that it upsets them that there is a number 2 promotion out here that they don't have any control of. But off topic, little rant. You guys can speak upon that if you want as well, because I do find it to be an interesting topic. But we get LA Knight. He's in the back. He's interviewed by Jackie Redmond. And, he says, week after week, he's tired of the vision. And before he can even really get into it, he is interrupted by CM Punk. And CM Punk, he says, we have to be on the same page heading into Paris. Seth Rollins, he has his goons. And that he's always going to have that in his back pocket. So we kind of have to be on the same page and be a united front up until we could possibly get to Paris, where it's every man for himself. And you see LA Knight, he says, Punk is talking about, I don't care if you don't like me. And LA Knight says, it's not about me not liking you. It's not about anything like that. This is business. And he's like, for the past 2 opportunities that I had to get at the world title, you stuck your nose in my business. He says, all of these different things, and he says, there's going to only be one man coming out of Paris with his hand in victory, and it's going to be L.A. Knight. Yeah, I think that's a potential big money match down the line too. L.A. Knight versus CM Punk. That match will be viewed as the unction to me. Something else I want to ask you guys about. What do you guys think about the possible return of Chris Jericho in the WWE? This is kind of something that sparked yesterday with him liking a post on Instagram about him potentially returning to the WWE. And for me, I honestly think that when it comes to the history of AEW, especially the early parts of it, Chris Jericho is a very important figure in it. They've talked about multiple different times his match with Kenny Omega at the Tokyo Dome kind of sparked and got the ball rolling on AEW. If you guys know, he's the very first AEW World Champion. Very much so in the early days, he was a very important factor in what they were doing. But currently, at the moment, I feel as if him leaving AEW would be kind of a addition by subtraction. He hasn't been on the show, in a couple of months, and it doesn't really feel as if anybody misses him. His name isn't brought up at all, on possible different matches. And I think that him going to WWE, I know people are kind of be like, oh, he's washed or this, but he's gonna go if him potentially going to WWE for like maybe a last hurrah, maybe another 2-year run, and we're getting a couple of different matches. I think even the Chris Jericho that we have now, I think that especially with us getting that nostalgia kick of him doing the list thing or him going back doing the Y2J stuff, I think that there's a potential matches that could possibly be good. Him running it with Carmelo Hayes, him running it with Penta, him running it, another match with Cody Rhodes, another match with CM Punk, something with him and LA Knight. I think there is potential for a couple of different good matches, and ending this all with the WWE Hall of Fame induction. And one thing that I think people don't pay enough attention to or don't consider it enough is I think that with what we've been seeing with the the counter programming of AEW, we've seen that WWE can be pretty petty. And I think one thing that I think that they would want to do is, I think everybody can agree, or at least for the most part, that Chris Jericho is borderline unwatchable in AEW at the moment. And I think that Triple H and WWE, they would want to show and kind of rub in AEW's face that, we have Chris Jericho, we have been able to present him to at least be watchable under our roof. And that would be kind of like a middle finger to AEW. He sucked with you guys, but we're able to turn this into something viewable for our audience. I think that's something that they would possibly want to do. Well, maybe I'm just spitballing, right? And then he just wants to go and play with Fozzy for the rest of his life and doesn't want to wrestle at all. Who knows? Next, we get into Penta versus Xavier Woods. If you guys have been following this saga, you guys remember Xavier Woods had that ridiculously large hat, and Penta, he sat there and he wore it and desecrated it. And Xavier, he's saying that's an $18,000 hat. So he wants Penta to give him his money back or his hat back. And this match was, surprisingly back and forth. You would assume, with Penta, somebody who WWE has been at least, for the most part, putting in some type of an effort to present him in a very valuable way, going up against Xavier, who, for the most part, is kind of an afterthought at the moment, with what they're doing with the New Day. That's another botched heel turn, right? They had that exciting, great segment with them bringing back Big E for the New Day reunion, and you had this newfound enthusiasm for the New Day after that. It was like, oh, we're going to see something fresh, something new, because it's been so long since we've seen a heel New Day, and this version, this is something that you can get excited about. And just fucking trash, right? Wasn't all that great. We've seen this in time and time again, and a lot of times we see all these different podcasts and wrestling commentators talk about this, moments over matches. That's a big time discussion when it comes to professional wrestling. What's more important, the moment or the match? And I think that there's a solid argument for moments are more important than matches. But we got that great moment, but it's just like the follow through. You know, it feels like those type of great moments are wasted if you don't come with a great follow through. And it feels like that heel turn was wasted. But we see Penta pick up the win with a Mexican Destroyer. Solid match, nothing crazy, nothing to the point to where you're gonna go goo goo gaga over. But it was straight. Guys, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't. We are less than 70 subs away from 3,000. So we're going to get there sooner rather than later. It'd be much appreciated. If you aren't subbed, to hit that sub button. Always remember it's free. You get a lot of content throughout the week. I'm a one-man shop when it comes to this stuff, right? Next, we get the Judgment Day, Finn Balor and JD McDonough versus Dragon Lee and Mr. Iguana. 2 stars coming out of the Triple Mania show. This is Mr. Iguana's Raw debut. Are you guys into Mr. Iguana? Mr. Iguana and Yennefer. If you guys don't know, my mother is Panamanian, and iguanas are consistently all over the streets and all over the islands. It's pretty much like how squirrels are here. You see an iguana everywhere. People eat the iguanas over there. Never had iguana. Doesn't really seem like something I'd be into. Maybe I'm a little bit too Americanized, but hey. But Mr. Iguana and the Yennefer, puppet, it seems to be very over here in the States. WWE immediately after Finn Balor pulled out that Demento puppet, that looked like the demon version of him. They put it on WWE Shop, $100. $100 to buy that puppet. It's so funny. The counter contrast of when it comes to WWE, they are quick. When they are just they are quick to put some type of catchphrase or some type of item. They're very good at this. Anything that has any type of momentum, they're quick to put it on sale on their website. And AEW is so slow to pick up on these things that it's funny, right? They had the Mercedes Moné puppet, never put it on AEWshop.com. They have the Finn Balor puppet, they immediately put it on, and they immediately start trying to price gouge people and charge $100 for it. But it's just funny how they do it. Guys, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe if you can. But you see the Judgment Day pick up the win. Mr. Iguana wasn't able to use Yennefer to his advantage to pick up the win. Finn Balor hit the coup de grace on Dragon Lee. 1, 2, 3. They start jumping the Judgment Day. They start jumping Dragon Lee and Mr. Iguana. But we see Vikingo make the save, the AAA Mega Champion. If you guys don't know, at the next Worlds Collide show next month, it's going to be Vikingo versus Dominic Mysterio for the AAA Mega Championship. So Vikingo is out here making, wrecking shop. He is getting cheered while in America, while he is getting booed in Mexico. But we see Dominic Mysterio, who's on ringside, be able to hit Vikingo in the back of the head with the IC Championship. No AJ Styles this week. He might be on vacation or something. But we see the Judgment Day standing tall. Vikingo, the guy who is in the middle of a big dog Roman Reigns-esque push in Mexico, who has been a guy who's been cemented as the face of this merger between, AAA and WWE. It's so funny, because Vikingo is somebody who, if you aren't familiar with his work, I think is very good. It's a very good wrestler. His match with Kenny Omega in AEW, I thought was very good. And the run that he was having previously in AAA, before they kind of just, pushed him as the poster boy of this thing, it was very good. So it's just, it's unfortunate that in Mexico, he's getting the boos that he's getting, but hey, people don't like being told what to like and how to like it. And we've seen multiple different cases of that, when it comes to booking here in the States. We get Becky Lynch. She's interviewed by Jackie Redmond backstage. She asked, Becky, she's like, why did you attack Natty? She said, I didn't attack Natty. She said, Natty attacked me. She came at me. She even gave Maxine a shot at the IC title. How gracious of Becky Lynch. And she says, Natty doesn't belong in my division. And she welcomes her back to the big leagues after Natty's making all these different appearances for these other, companies. She was in, and she's made appearances in NWA. She's made appearances in Bloodsport. All these different, shots that she's made. She's having this low-key legend run on these other shows. I find so funny. And nobody seems to talk about this. We've seen different gimmicks, of these apprentices, like that Maxine is playing, but we've never really had, to my knowledge, somebody had this apprentice gimmick, and the whole gimmick that they have for her is, man, this person really freaking sucks. That's that. Am I the only one who notices that? Like, that's the whole gimmick of Maxine. They're like, man, this person really sucks in the ring. Poor lady. Very attractive woman, and I feel like she has a bright future in the division. Sooner rather than later, and we've seen in WWE throughout the history that, ring work isn't the main priority. Jey Uso is a prime example. It doesn't matter if you're the best wrestler. If you have a cool entrance, a certain look, and a certain way that you connect with the fans, you'll have success in the company. And I do believe that Maxine will sooner rather than later, if given the opportunity, be able to build that connection. Next, we get this video similar to what we got last week with Bayley. And this piques my interest. Anytime we get something different in pro wrestling or something that we don't see on a regular basis, I tend to enjoy it, because we get so many times in wrestling where we see so many different things, recycled or repackaged or, influenced when it comes to storylines, different characters, all these different things, that, like, I kind of like it where we get something a little bit different or off the wall. We see Bayley in this room. We see voices in her head talking to her. Shout out to Randy Orton. She's, bringing up all these accomplishments that she has. You're a former, women's champion. You're the first ever women's tag team champion. What are you doing? What are we doing? All these different things. You cared about friends over this. If you listen to me, I'll steer you in the right direction. And you see Bayley kind of looking confused and, going back and forth with this voice in her head. And she says, I don't know what I need. And then the voice in her head says, what about a hug? So we might get a return of the hugger, maybe this split personality type of deal with Bayley. Either way, we need something fresh and something new, especially with what I'm going to talk about later on with Naomi. We're going to need something different that is going to spark more interest in the characters outside of Becky Lynch, and something that's going to be able to replace Naomi with her absence. And I think that they possibly have something with Bayley with this. We also got no Lyra on the show this week, so maybe she is on a mini vacation as well. Who knows? We get Becky versus Natty, a match that we've seen multiple times throughout the years. It looked as if, Natty was hurt, because Becky, she rammed Natty's shoulder into the ring post, and it looked as if, there was a possibility that she was injured, but we didn't see the dreaded X. So throughout that match, she was selling it for the most part. We see Natty tap out to this armor. We see Maxine try to take Natty, and while they're walking, their backs turned to Becky. Becky sits there and puts this armor on Maxine, but we get a save from Nikki Bella. Yes, the Bella Army stand tall. And we see Becky get put in the Rack Attack 2.0. Sheamus, somebody who's been brawling multiple weeks with Rusev, something that has been a running gag for the last couple of weeks. He's being interviewed by Jackie Redmond. He's asked about, basically what's the deal with Sheamus, Sheamus and Rusev. He says, Rusev kind of has this God complex. And you see Rusev, shouting from the distance, and we get the security to break these two guys. We see Adam Pearce basically come out, be as red as a tomato, because he is just up to here with these guys. He says, it's enough. You guys got to get this out of your system. At Clash at Paris, we're going to get a Donnybrook match, which is basically an Irish street fight between these two guys. I've said it before as well. I don't think people give a damn about Rusev in the WWE right now. I think people like Sheamus. So I feel like he gets reactions for these matches, but I don't think anybody cares about Rusev. But I could be wrong, right? Do you like Rusev? If you do, let me know in the chat. Guys, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe. Next, we get Jey Uso in the back. He is warming up for his main event match against Braun Breaker in this ECW Hardcore, Extreme Rules match. And CM Punk, he approaches him and he says, hey, Jay. He's like, I tried to get LA Knight on board, but he's not listening. He says, just want to let you know that I got your back. Jey Uso tells him, no disrespect. He said, but I didn't ask for your help. CM Punk, he says, I'm trying to get us all to Paris, and Jey Uso is like, what do you mean, get me to Paris? He's like, at Paris, in this four-way, it's every man for himself. This is, no disrespect again. He's like, but I don't want to, owe anybody any favors. I want to do this thing alone. So he's prepping for his match. Next, we get into the segment that everybody has been waiting for. All these different rumors, all these different speculation of what we're going to hear. Naomi, she is in the ring with Adam Pearce. And we keep on talking about, the whole thing, the verbiage that they were using, they're talking about, she's going to address, the women's championship, so the uncertainty surrounding the women's championship, the situation surrounding it. As soon as you heard that, you knew that she was going to relinquish the title, right? So then you hear all these different people talking, this is a medical thing, but don't really look into that as a negative thing. So I think everybody kind of put the, sort of connecting the dots and figured that she was going to announce that she was pregnant, right? And her and Jimmy Uso, Big Jim, they were on Stephanie McMahon's podcast, I believe, last week. And they recorded a bonus, footage for that podcast. And they teased it a little bit before this segment where they were going to tease, hey, we're going to make this announcement. And they played it in the ring. And it's confirmed. Naomi and Naomi and Jimmy Uso, they are having a baby Uso, right? Congratulations to the happy couple. I know that career-wise, this is probably bad timing. But hey, we're never going to sit there and kind of shit on somebody for starting a family, right? I know this is something that Naomi has spoken about multiple times in public, talking about, she is somebody who's 37, so her biological clock is ticking. She's talked about how, she feels now as if, they're in a situation with the company where you can go off and start a family and you won't be penalized as, like you were previously under like Vince McMahon. And this is something she's talked about. She's wanted a lot. And you saw the crowd, chanting, you deserve it. She was emotional throughout the whole thing. You got baby Uso chants. You see, Naomi, very, you see she very emotional on her face, but she gets back into character and she kicks Adam Pearce out of the ring. And she says, I've had to relinquish my title before, to you. And, I got to relinquish it again. But this time, I'm not handing you shit. She kicks him out. And she says she hopes he trips over his, church shoes. All these different things. Everybody does the na, 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 that song. And Naomi, she says, the women's division, you have one person to thank, and that one person is Big Jim, because if it wasn't for Big Jim, I was going to be dog walking you guys for the remaining rest of this year. But Big Jim enjoys through Netflix and chill. She says, so for the next 9 months, do whatever you want when it comes to, and she placed the title on the mat. She says, do whatever you want, but after these 9 months, I'm going to come back, and whoever has this belt, you should proceed with caution when I come back. So congratulations to the happy couple. The bloodline continues. Just when you think, it's coming close to an end, boom, another one of those suckers pop out. Guys, please remember to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't. It helps the channel out in more ways than you even know. Like I said earlier, guys, we are less than 70 subs away from 3,000. So if you could hit that sub button, if you haven't, it would be much appreciated on my end. Next, we get a backstage segment, the Judgment Day. They're walking through the hallway, but there's one noticeable absent. That is Dom. And you see the Judgment Day asking, where is Dom? And we cut to him speaking with Grande Americano. And he asks, Grande, what do you think about that? And Grande says, I'll think about it, sucio. That means dirty in Spanish, if you don't know. And you see Finn ask Damian, what was that about? It says, I'm just looking for ways to keep the bloodline on top. We get into the main event between Jey Uso and Braun Breaker. The Battle of the Spears. The best spear in the business versus probably the worst spear in the business. And this was some, for the most part, like I said, opening up the show, you knew that as soon as they made the stipulation where it was like no DQ, that we were going to get a schmoz fest. We are getting multiple different run-ins. And that's exactly what we got. I don't think that's shocking for anybody. I think the fact that I like that they at least made it a no DQ type of match, so there won't be a way to end the show in a DQ. But there was a spot early in the match where Braun Breaker was flipped on the outside, and Jey Uso, he came to the ring, very New Jack, centric entrance, with the Tupac style bandana around his, forehead, and he brought the shopping cart. But there was a spot where Braun, he flipped over outside of the rope, and his knee and his leg landed on the shopping cart. It looked as if he might have gotten hurt, on the outside, because it took a while for him to get up, but he was able to progress through the match. And Jey Uso, it was a show where we got all these different, chairs and all these different, objects in the ring, and it looked as if we were going to get to a point where Jey Uso was going to pick up the win, but Big Bronson Reed pushed Jey Uso off the top rope. Jey Uso was eating some tsunamis. Then we see LA Knight come and make the save. Numbers game starting to pile up after Seth Rollins took LA Knight out from behind. Then we hear CM Punk's music hit, try to even the odds a little bit. There was a table set up on the outside, and Jey Uso was in the middle of the ring, but LA Knight was on the apron trying to fend off from Bronson Reed. And it got to a point where CM Punk was attempting to hit Seth Rollins. Seth ducked, and LA Knight ended up going through the table from CM Punk. You know what that means. Next week we are going to get, more friction brewing between Punk and Knight, right? That's a given. Seth Rollins and CM Punk, they brawl in the crowd, leaving Braun Breaker out there by himself. And we hear the Tribal Chiefs music hit. Braun Breaker looks like, oh shit, what do I do? Let me run. But when he runs, he gets sneak attacked by the OTC. We get that. Jey Uso gets Braun Breaker back into the ring. Bronson Reed and Roman Reigns, they brawl. Jey Uso hits the Uso splash through a table to Bronson Reed. 1, 2, 3. The Yeet Man picks up the W. We also get confirmed after tonight that we are going to get Bronson Reed versus Roman Reigns at Clash in Paris. Hopefully it is a Jays on a pole match, but who knows? But that's the way that we ended Raw. And like I said, there was interesting moments. The video package with Bayley I enjoyed. I enjoy the fact that Naomi was able to, announce to the world that she's starting a family. And I liked the continuation of the stuff that we kind of saw from the Triple Mania show, but the Vision stuff. I mean, I don't know how the hell did I not mention this in the beginning of the show. Well, that Paul Heyman promo, I didn't even mention the most important part of the promo, right? So he's talking about ECW lore and how they announced the Extreme Rules match, right? He's talking about all these ECW lore. He talks about how they're at the Wells Fargo Center and how they're only a little bit away from the bingo halls that they used to run for ECW. He talks about all the greats. He talks about Sandman and Van Dam. And the late great Sabu. He says the late great Tommy Dreamer, and he says I know that Tommy Dreamer is still alive, but he shouldn't be. Poor Tommy. Tommy on Busted Open tomorrow is gonna have something to say about it. But it's funny. If you guys don't know, Tommy Dreamer has this famous story about how like at WrestleMania. I don't remember if it was 17 or 18. He planned on, blowing Heyman's brains out. And it's just funny. That Tommy's going to have something to say. But that was that was another good highlight from the show. But guys, if you don't know, if this is your first time being here, we are gonna have the AEW Dynamite post show, after that show on Wednesday. This weekend is Forbidden Door. We'll have a post show following that, and Clash at Paris next weekend is kind of iffy because I might have a personal thing going on during the show. But whether it's a post show or just individual videos following it, you're going to get coverage of that, and you're going to get coverage of all the stuff that's happening in between those shows as well. Guys, if you haven't already, please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't. It has been a nice night kicking it with you guys, but I am Kevin Zwicker. I'm out.